All right, hello. Our keynote speaker for today is Andrea Goulet. She is the host of the Legacy Code Rocks podcast. So if you haven't listened to that, I highly recommend it. She is working on a new book called Empathy-Driven Software Development, and she has her own company set up to deal with empathy in tech called Heartware.dev, HEARTWARE.dev. And I am just going to turn it over to Andrea because whatever introduction I do will not do Andrea justice. So.
Awesome. Great. Is everybody able to hear me okay? You good? Sam, we're good? Awesome. All right. So I am here to chat with you a little bit about how empathy is a technical skill. All right. So good morning. Thank you so much for coming. And today we're going to chat about how empathy is a technical skill. And I have kind of an interesting way that I got into software. And so kind of the mix between my background has really given me an interesting insight into why empathy is a technical skill. So I started off in sales and I learned that I really didn't like cold calling. So the way I was trained was to basically meet strangers, just kind of like walk into their area of business and kind of give a pitch. And I didn't find that very effective. So I got a manual, hacked the crap out of my CRM, which is where I kept all my contacts. It's a big database. Created all these custom queries, templates, and added fields. And soon I was the number 3 rep in the nation, having really not had a whole lot of sales experience. And I really credit it to kind of this system that I built. A new friend had reached out to me and said, actually, what you're doing isn't quite sales, it's copywriting. And what copywriting is it's using the written word to persuade and influence and motivate people into action. And that was what I was doing with my presentations, or with my letters that I was putting in the CRM. Then I went to my 10-year high school reunion, and a good friend of mine said, actually, I've been reading your blog, and what you're actually doing is programming, because you are taking inputs. I would meet people at different networking events. You're putting them into your database. You're, changing things around. You're programming, and then you got outputs, right? So then I started learning through this idea of software modernization that the key to all of this is empathy. So we started Core DevOps in 2009, so it's been about 13 years. And by using practices that are informed by empathy, that's how we're able to manage a lot of the technical debt. So now I'm really focused on technical empathy. So how do you actually operationalize empathy? What are the mechanics? And so that's what we're going to go over a little bit today. So if you find empathy confusing, you are not alone. Empathy is objectively confusing. I thought I knew what empathy was, and then I went to write a book about it. And empathy can just feel like this tangled mess, because we typically think of empathy as creating, like walking in someone else's shoes, or even if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll see that it's imagining what it's like to be in someone else's situation. But those are actually projection. It's not empathy. And that idea of mentalizing is only one small part. The other thing is that researchers use wildly inconsistent terms. There is no real consensus within the literature, and so that makes it hard. Another thing is that empathy is only about 150 years old as a term, but already it's this crazy linguistic journey. And so now it's a contronym, which means it means the opposite of itself. It means to both project into and also to draw out from another person. So that can be a little confusing. Another reason that it's confusing is that the word sympathy is both a synonym and an antonym, because if you look back to the writings of some 18th century philosophers, such as Hume and Smith, they use the word sympathy, but they mean empathy. And today, sympathy means like kind of a more distant, like, oh, I feel for you, whereas empathy means I feel with you. And another is that there's this relationship with compassion. And when you look at it, it's kind of a circular dependency because empathy requires compassion, and empathy is also a part of compassion. So, like, where do you start? This quote I love. It's by Henry Miller, and it describes how confusion is a word that we have invented for an order which is not yet understood. And I think this definitely applies to empathy. It applies to software development too, right? If you look at something, you think that it's really confusing, but it just looks like you haven't understood it yet. And there often is this underlying, mechanism in organization that we can learn. So here's what empathy is. Empathy is a system of interconnected skills. It's not a feeling, right? And it enables us to do four things. It enables us to resonate with emotions, whether that's ourselves or other people. It enables us to reason about different experiences using our cognitive abilities. We're able to reflect back an understanding and then respond with compassion. So empathy uses your whole brain and your biology as well. So it requires motor engagement and your emotional side and your cognitive side. It is a whole brain experience. And it's also considered a very advanced skill. This is something that you can learn. I also love this quote by Arthur C. Clarke, which is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think the same thing is true with skills too, because any sufficiently advanced skill also can look like magic. And I think about when I first learned how to code, seeing all of the stuff in the back end, it was like, whoa, there's this whole world. Or if I'm watching the Olympics and I see someone who is just like doing all these twists and turns and flips, it's like, how do they even do that? Right? Watching artists and woodworkers, one of my good friends, my neighbor, like just watching her parent, it looks like magic. But I know that she's read a whole lot of books and she's really practiced that skill. So if we look at kind of any skill, there is this depth that you can get of technical understanding. So the idea of what makes something technical is that you have deep knowledge in the subject. There's also kind of precise language. There's this jargon and kind of domain terminology. It's a very specialized set of skills, and typically it's a practical application. And another piece is following the research, right? Looking for what actually is this domain and what are ways that I can get better, right? And it's often not just intuition, right? There's this training that's involved as well. So now let's look at kind of how empathy works. So in software, we have what's called the happy path, right? And empathy definitely has a happy path as well. When empathy is working great, we see a lot of benefits, right? So overall health and well-being of both yourself and others improves, right? You've got healthy conflict that is based in tasks, not relationships, and that's used to foster innovation, creativity, and better collaboration. Group members are able to be honest and vulnerable without the fear that their trust is going to be abused, and that can deepen connection. So if you think about conducting a retrospective, for example, those need empathy, right? I would argue that pretty much any of the agile practices, empathy is kind of the underlying foundation of it. The other piece of empathy is that it balances the needs of individuals, groups, and then society at large. So it's not getting sucked into one person. It's not only focusing on the big picture. It's not only focusing on yourself. It's putting all of those things into balance and thinking about things like ethics and accessibility. How do we make things equitable? Empathy can help us there. And finally, the empathy skills are regularly developed through intention and training and practice. So when empathy is going great, this is what it looks like. But, there's also edge cases, right? So kind of the whole idea of, what's a feature and what's a bug, right? We see that same thing with empathy. So we can get so sucked into one person that we neglect our own needs. At the same time, we can overly focus on ourselves. And so then that way we're taking advantage of others, right? And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there is kind of an idea. One of the big ones is intergroup empathy bias. And what this means is that we tend to have more empathy for people who are like us, and that can create this us versus them mentality. So being aware of what these edge cases are, that can help us get back to the happy path. All right. And when we look at all of this combined, this is what I call technical empathy. And when we look at empathy in a technical way, as opposed to more colloquial way, it can help us consistently achieve more positive outcomes. So how does empathy work, right? What's kind of the process of empathy? So this is kind of a model that I've put together to help us understand and kind of walk through, because one of the things that I hear a lot when I give these presentations, and I've been talking about empathy in the context of software development for almost 10 years now, is I get people kind of a line out the door and it's like, I'm a back-end developer. I never interact with the customer, right? I don't see how empathy is relevant to me. So, and also this craving for like, I want to see the mechanics, like how does empathy actually work? Because just saying have more empathy, that's not really doing it for me. I need more details. So we can think of empathy in the same way that we think of like continuous improvement or CI/CD, right? First, we prepare, right? So we get ready, we take training. Next, there is an empathy exchange, right? So you can think of this as like the deployment process, right? We have to deliver something. So that's either an action or an artifact. We also have to recover because empathy takes a lot of energy. It is a cognitively expensive and a metabolically expensive activity for us. And then we reflect what went well, what could be better, what should change. We update our mental model, and then we prepare for the next exchange. Within that, we can look at kind of what an exchange is. Now, empathy is both an automatic process and it's a deliberative one. So it's kind of like breathing, right? You're going throughout your day kind of breathing, but you can also place a lot of intention around it. So with empathy, there is this automatic component where you see someone who's sad and maybe you're like, oh, you know, it's kind of a quick activation. But this can also take place cognitively. So recognizing, okay, here's a situation where every time this situation comes up, I'm going to want to focus on having more empathy. So it might be with a specific person that you're interacting with, or it might be an activity such as, okay, every time I do a code review, I'm going to practice empathy. Next, there is this deliberative effort, right? So Daniel Kahneman, who's an economist, describes this as kind of system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 is kind of the automatic, like you're just going about your day. System 2 is where you go slow, you like really think things through, and you're focused. So this is typically an exchange either synchronously with another person. It can also be you're writing something that's going to be asynchronous, or you can be focusing on empathy towards yourself, right? And then there's going to be some kind of cognitive closure where it's like, okay, I'm good. I'm going to go back. And then ending something on like a deliverable. So that can be a hug to someone. It can be writing an email. It can be something, you know, along those lines. So delivering, acting, or artifacts is a good way to look at that. And the way, you know, I know this is a lot to kind of digest, but the way that I think about this also is kind of like a race. So if you have an athlete, there's the event, right? They're training for a race. And so an empathy exchange is kind of like that event. And then the rest of the cycle is preparing for that event. It's the training, it's the recovery, it's the watching the videos and how can I do better, right? And what you're doing is you're getting ready for that next exchange. There's also this idea of decomposing empathy, which I think is just fascinating. So Dr. Jean Dicity in 2011 put forth this idea that empathy is kind of a monolithic concept, isn't really serving us anymore. So it's time to kind of look at things in a more discrete way. And he uses terms, monolithic concept of empathy. Empathy needs to be decomposed, right? We need to break it down into its component processes. And as software developers, this is what we do, right? So this can help make empathy more accessible because the way that we understand empathy is very close to the way that we work with software. So here's kind of the way that, looking at all the different research, here's the model that kind of I've used to look at how do we decompose empathy so that it works on a regular basis. So first we have the functional components. And this is what Dr. DCD kind of put together. But these are the things in your brain and in your body that help make empathy arise. Next, each one of those components can be broken down further into learnable skills, right? So what are the specific things we need to learn? Then within those skills, like similar to how an athlete, it's like they might want to improve their speed, but how do they do that? What is the specific training? Like, how can they improve their technique? Finally, empathy takes place within a specific context, right? So there's a situation, there's people, there's, monitoring our energy. So paying attention to our environmental factors, our situational awareness is important. Then we have at the end, we have motivated actions. And this is where empathy-driven development happens, right? It's in small moments where we can pay attention and go, okay, now I'm going to enter that empathy cycle. And we're using all of those different skills, but we can move away from empathy because we're not motivated. And then we can also move towards empathy. So looking at this whole thing as a system and figuring out how can we leverage different aspects of the system to help us create those more consistent outcomes. And this is exactly what we do in software too, right? We're looking at bugs and we're looking at impediments, right? We're looking at refactoring and how can I understand things more? And this is very similar to what we're doing with empathy as well. So I'm going to walk through each one of these and kind of get a little bit of context. So first we have these 4 functional components. The first one is what's called empathic concern. This is sometimes called compassion. Sometimes it's described as broader than that, but this is the active desire to reduce suffering through feelings of care and compassion. So it's generating warm feelings. It's thinking about common humanity. It's connecting to the feeling of, I want people to not be in pain. I want people to be safe. I care about people, right? And this is so, so, so critical. So this is where empathy starts. Next, we have calm. So we need to emotionally regulate ourselves. And so this is being aware of our internal and external signals so that we can effectively modulate and describe what's going on within ourselves. Because there's a lot of evidence that we can't engage in things like active listening and some of these other important aspects that we typically think of with empathy unless we have learned how to calm ourselves down and kind of, I had a therapist early in my life that described this as putting your own feelings on a shelf, right? So it's setting aside kind of your own sense of feelings for a moment so that you can fully listen, but you're also putting a container around yourself, right? You're recognizing that you're still present, but you're paying attention to the needs of another person rather than putting your own needs in the forefront. So you're still paying attention, you're kind of modulating between the two, but also just paying a lot of attention to how you're feeling. Next is that analytical layer, right? And this is where it's like we tend to think of empathy only as a feeling or only getting swept up in this emotion. But there's a really important aspect of it called cognitive empathy. And this is the type of empathy that I learned the most deeply when I was a copywriter. But this is intentionally engaging in cognition to explore a different perspective. So learning to analyze what is someone's point of view or what are they saying. And this becomes really important as well, particularly when it comes to ethics. We can get so sucked into one person's story. This is called the identifiable victim effect, where we then forget about how our actions might impact a broader group. So it's paying attention to kind of all of these different needs through more of an analysis. And then finally, we have connect. And this is known as affective empathy. Affect kind of is the feeling side of things. And this is recognizing and sharing another person's emotional state. And this is where you've got that kind of heart connection, where you are, communicating, where you are thinking about what does this person need, and then executing on it. So empathic concern, emotional regulation, cognitive empathy, affective empathy, those are all kind of the technical terms, but the way I describe it is care, calm, consider, connect. So as you're going through an empathy exchange, you can kind of keep this, sort of in mind, and it's care, calm, consider, connect. Care, calm, consider, connect, right? Am I rooted in common humanity? Do I care about this person that I'm deliberately trying to have empathy with? Am I calm? How are my emotions? Let me also layer in, am I trying to be objective and balance that, draw towards someone's feelings? And also layering on the analytical piece. And then how can I best connect to this person? What do they need? How can I serve them? So back to our kind of continuous empathy cycle, right? So during the empathy exchange, we have this care, calm, consider, connect, right? And then once we kind of get that cognitive closure, then we can figure out what we need to deliver. Now, I also want to say that this process doesn't have to take very long, especially if you are really familiar with somebody and you know what they need, right? You can just do kind of a quick mental check-in where it's like, okay, what does this person need? Okay, yeah, this is it, right? So once, and this can take maybe 10 seconds, right? If it's like, yep, I'm going to just glance over, what I've written. Yeah, that's good. So, but just learning to pay attention to where those opportunities are. So next we have learnable skills, right? So it's helpful to kind of break things into the functional components, but then it's like, okay, well, how do I connect? Right. And so these are the different ways that we can look at different skills and abilities so that we can improve our outcomes. And this is what I call empathy system architecture. So I've got, there's a whole bunch of different skills, but I think the ones that are most important to us while we are building software are these. So under care, we have compassion, which is that generating warm feelings. We also have attunement, which is that alignment and kind of synchronization with another person's needs, being able to validate their perspective. And then having a propensity towards generosity, right? And giving without necessarily expecting anything in return. Under calm, we have boundaries, which really surprised me. I did not know just how important boundaries are in effective empathy. But we can think about this again in the way we think about software. For example, in domain-driven design, there's this really important component called bounded contexts, where we need to kind of draw boundaries around different, functional areas of the code so that we can better work within it. Awareness and mindfulness, learning to pay attention and notice is really important. So is regulating our capacity. Empathy is really hard when we're tired or sick or, hungry. Like there are physical needs that can get in the way of our ability to empathize. Under considering, it's paying attention to kind of like, where can we go wrong, right? If we are inferring what someone else is feeling, it's recognizing that it's a guess. And our ability to be accurate on average is about 30% of the time, right? So, there's a 7 out of 10 chance that we're wrong. And the best empathizers that have ever been measured are accurate about half the time. We also have mental models. So how are we constructing the world? And then ethics, how are we aligning our actions so that they are moral, fair, and just? What kind of rule sets are we considering? And I think of this kind of like integrity constraints that we might use in a database to make sure that our data is clean, right? Ethics acts kind of like, integrity constraints would in the code base. And then finally, we have connecting. So how are we constructing our messaging, right? And that's our verbal and nonverbal communication. How are we thinking about our relationships in terms of networks? So, there are some times where we want to strengthen, a relationship tie with trust and being more vulnerable. But at the same time, if people haven't respected our boundaries or our physical or mental health is in jeopardy because we're being manipulated or abused or, just not treated kindly, then we may want to kind of back off and set stronger boundaries. And then finally, we have artifacts. And this is leaving durable evidence of our thinking so that other people can have empathy for us and reconstruct our thinking in the future. Next, it's like, how do I get these specific practices? So what are the ways that I can learn these skills and practice these skills and strengthen these skills? And I was chatting with a friend of mine, and he said, I just want like an empathy personal trainer. I want to go to the empathy gym because I need to know what are the specific exercises that I can do to kind of level up my empathy. I get that it's a skill, but what are the discrete things I need to do? So we can think of the specific practices again in this way. So if we're looking at our physical health, right, we can look at kind of in broad categories. So we've got cardio, flexibility, strength, endurance, right? So those can be considered kind of the functional areas. We also have, how do you measure these things? So flexibility, it's okay. How do we stretch? Or with our strength, how much weight can we lift? Or what are the number of reps that we can do? And then we can create like a specific training plan based around what are our goals and what are our constraints in our context and what is our current state. So for me, it's like, okay, I want to ride my bike to the office and I'm going to go on hikes and, try to get these small things in where I can. Not always perfect. And the same thing is going to happen with empathy. You're not always going to hit every single goal every single time, but having a plan really helps. So when you look at all of these different skills, you can then start to kind of map it out. Like which ones feel easy, which ones feel hard, which ones do I already have developed, which ones do I need to develop? And then we can create a similar empathy training plan, right? So for me, I know I have an optimism bias. And so I tend to commit to a deadline and forget like exactly how hard it's, or how long it's going to take. I tend to get sucked into notifications. So I'm planning, paying attention to our notification management, small breaks during the day. And that's going to help me cultivate the compassion that I need and also, regulate my capacity. And so there are different things that we can do. And I think this is the other thing is that empathy is incredibly personalized. It's incredibly individualized. And this is where you can start to see that taking place. What are the things that you can do to really level up these skills? And that's probably going to be different than somebody else. So here are some examples here. And I know Tom was going to put these in the chat for me since my kind of setup makes it hard for me to see. But let's look at compassion, right? So we've got this with each one of these skills, and you can create this like knowledge tree that goes really deep in each one of these things. But here are two examples. So compassion can be broken into two different things. There's loving kindness, which is that feeling of warmth and connectedness with humanity. And then there's also mindfulness, which is the ability to pay attention and notice. And so there are two different training programs that are really useful that focus on teaching and developing these very specific skills. So with loving kindness, there's what's called compassion cultivation training, and that comes out of Stanford. So you can see that at compassioninstitute.com/CCT. And then there's also mindfulness-based stress reduction, which was developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn. Both of these draw a lot on Buddhist practices, but they are also incredibly secular. So even though they are inspired by and looked at, there is a ton of research behind these that show that they really work. So there's a lot of different MSBR or MBSR programs. So the link that I've provided, it gives a really good overview, and then that way you can kind of start your journey there. So let's take a moment and look at what one of these very specific kind of drills, if you will, right? These are practices that you want to do regularly throughout the day so that you're getting better, right? And this is the thing that it's like with practice, then it becomes easier over time. So this is a loving kindness meditation practice, and this is adapted from Sharon Salzberg. And the idea is that you start with yourself. So we'll do this just real quick if you want to join me. So take a deep breath in, and then out, in, out. And then what you do is you start with yourself. It's really important to make sure that you're grounded in empathy for yourself so that you have enough capacity to give to others. And this buffers us against burnout and distress. So we're going to say a mantra. May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I live with ease. And when we can do this on a regular basis, it's really feeling it, right? It's not just saying the words, it's allowing that to really change our affective state and generating these feelings of warmth and compassion. Next, we move on to someone else. So this is someone you care about, right? You can think of a really good friend or your spouse or someone you really enjoy working with, right? But this is generating those feelings of using well wishes, right? So may you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you live with ease. And it's visualizing that person and recognizing you are your own individual, but sending those like good intentions outward. Next is focusing on someone who challenges you. And you want to make sure that it's not kind of like overly traumatic, right? You might want to work with, a professional around that, but someone who maybe you work with, but you just struggle to understand, right? So you can think of, may they be safe. May they be happy. May they be healthy. May they live with ease. And then finally, you end with the idea of interconnectedness. So you're bringing the idea of all of humanity into this. So may all beings be safe. May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings live with ease. And you can, if it's too much to kind of jump from, one person to a huge group, you can start with smaller groups. So, may my team be happy. May my team be safe, right? May my team be healthy. May my team live with ease. And there are moments where we can practice this. So for example, when we're waiting for a test suite to run, right? That gives us, a little bit of time. So just running through this really quickly and just practicing noticing those opportunities to send loving kindness to other people. And that's also going to have the benefit of protecting yourself against stress and depression and, kind of this idea of feeling distressed when you're empathizing. Almost there, right? So next we have situational awareness. So what is the specific context that this event is taking place in? So these are the details of the environment and your energy levels and how emotions play in and kind of who are you working with. And this can help you recognize when empathy is useful and how to apply it. And I love this quote also by Rollo May. So this is sometimes attributed to Viktor Frankl, who wrote man's search for meaning. But when I looked into the citation of it, it's actually Rollo May. And the idea is that human freedom involves our capacity to pause between the stimulus and the response. And in that pause, to choose the one response toward which we wish to throw our weight. So this is the idea that, we can have that automatic response. We can have that kind of system one approach, but we can also pause and reflect and think about what are the conscious ways that we want to act. So here's an example, right? Production just went down. And so which response are we going to choose? Are we going to move towards shame, which is, being mean and unkind and critical? It's focusing on disconnection and maybe isolating yourself or another person. And then it's this idea of like really personalized negativity, right? So, thinking of like, I'm such a horrible person, this isn't good, or, it's all your fault, those kinds of things. We can also move towards compassion, right? If we're motivated in the right way, where it's like, okay, I'm gonna be warm and kind and understanding. I'm gonna recognize kind of the common humanity. This is a mistake that lots of people make. And then there's a sense of healthy accountability. So when you're operating with empathy, it doesn't mean not holding people accountable. It doesn't mean, trying to hide your mistakes. It doesn't mean, being completely happy and never having boundaries all the time, right? There are consequences for actions, but you can uphold those consequences in a way that is warm and kind and understanding instead of mean and critical and negative. So how do we know which response to choose? Well, this gets us at the heart of where empathy-driven development shows up. And it's about our motivation and how are we motivated to act, right? So again, back to our idea of an athlete, am I motivated to wake up early and go for that run, right? Am I motivated to, do the strength training that I need to do to be faster? Right. And so what are those things that, consistently are going to help you train and are going to help you move towards empathy instead of moving away? And that's exactly what happens. So, when we think of motivation, there's kind of two different aspects of it. We can be motivated to avoid something, and we can also be motivated to approach something. So when empathy feels painful or really hard, it's like, I don't know, right? When empathy feels like it's just too costly, like it's going to, take too many resources, or, it's just not something that we're able to do. Maybe our capacity isn't high enough, right? Or if it interferes with a competing goal. And so this is important when we're thinking about software, because a culture of urgency, right? Like, I don't have time because I'm so focused on getting this out urgently that I can't have empathy because time is that competing goal. We approach empathy when we know that it provides a benefit, right? So focusing on kind of what are the overall picture of empathy. Also recognizing that it can help us deepen social connections, right? It's the place where we can access belonging and a feeling of being connected. And that's super important as humans, that we need that. And also that it appears desirable. So if we are in a culture where it's like, no, we're going to take the time, we're going to focus, empathy is important, right? Empathy is part of our development practice. And this is similar to kind of how do you motivate folks to do, test-driven development, right? It's these small unit tests that over time, can really build in pieces of the system that give you a lot of safety, and then that can drive your development practice. So here's where things show up, right? And here are kind of the concrete things that we can see. When we avoid empathy and we have that layer of shame, you get a toxic culture, right? It's like, don't blame me, or you might hide and say, no one can find out. Oh my gosh, I can't tell anybody. I'm not going to bring this up at the retrospective, right? You might resign and just be like, none of this even matters. Why am I even doing this? We might say, I'm not going to help you. That's not my job, right? Or we might blame people and say, mistakes are going to get you fired, right? There's a lot of risk there. I told you so, or you've ruined everything. Why do you even do this? Or the big one is, you don't belong here. And these are things that are real, right? These are things that are said. And it's hard to move from this culture to one where we are approaching empathy and we are operating from compassion, where we're still holding people accountable, but it's more of like, let's collaborate. And we're thinking about the system, like what's wrong with the system? How can we all work together? It's that common humanity as well, where it's like, you know what? I brought production down several times. It's okay. Like, we're going to get through this. I have one person who said that, you're a real seasoned developer when you bring down production, because it's something that's kind of happens a lot. And it's a very common experience. Not something we want, but it's definitely not something that only one person has ever done, right? It's being able to look at that aspect of the retrospectives where it's like everyone did their best. And that can be really hard for people to believe. But when we look at empathy and compassion and we practice these skills, that becomes much easier and we begin to believe it, right? We can look at experimentations and, look at root causes and think about what can we learn here? Are there any opportunities from this experience? And then offering support. So I know this is really hard. What does support look like to you right now? There are so many opportunities. I know this is probably a huge slide where it's there's a lot going on. But if we think about it, where are the opportunities where empathy exchanges show up? Where we can actually practice these ideas of care, calm, consider, connect, right? And they might not be in the most obvious places, but think about when you're writing an error message, someone's going to read that. And so are you taking the time to recognize that you're not writing for the compiler, you're writing for people, right? The compiler is just a tool. It's not the end. And so thinking about, okay, how can I write an error message in a way that is the most helpful? We can think about this too in alt text, right? Guilty. I used to not write alt text in a way that it was kind of more of a check the box activity. But then when my friend's Taylor got in a car accident and lost his vision, and it was all of a sudden learning about how important that was, I had that emotional connection. And then I had that motivation to really think about, okay, what's going to help Taylor? So, tons of different places like logging and how do we structure our files and bug reports and, looking at localization and documentation. How do we refactor things so they're easy to read? All of these become important opportunities and the ability to learn how to notice. So this has been a lot of information. I hope that it's been helpful. And oops, excuse me, it went to the end. All right, so a couple more slides. So empathy isn't magic, right? It's not something that is only in the realm of the genetically gifted, right? It's something that all of us have the capacity for, and it's a system of skills that you can learn and that you can develop. And the idea is that technical ability, and that includes empathy, requires patience and practice. You're not going to level up these skills overnight, right? It's a dedication to continuously getting better and also being kind to yourself. So don't focus on being perfect. There is no such thing as perfect empathy. Instead, focus on progress and focus on continually making things better and learning as you grow. So best next steps, right? Where do you go from here? These are some of the best places that I've found to really dive into some of the mechanics of how do I start to have compassion? And being able to operate out of compassion is the most important first step for enabling empathy. So there's two different aspects of empathy. There's empathy for others and there's empathy for yourself. So a great book by Sharon Salzberg is Real Happiness at Work. And so I love this one because there's a lot of different compassion practices that are a little bit more abstract. And this brings in really concrete examples for how can you apply happiness and compassion-driven practices in the context of a work setting. There's also Kristen Neff, who is the preeminent researcher on self-compassion. And so her book and her website is just chock full of like different research and different resources to help you develop that empathy for yourself. So that's what I have. Thank you all very much. And so if you wanted to get in touch with me, I've got a lot of different things going on. So training, speaking, and book updates is at heartware.dev. Software modernization, I lead Corgi Bytes as well. And then we have the 2 different communities. So if you are a software mender, I know Sam has been part of this community for a long time. You can go to legacycode.rocks. We have virtual meetups, we have a podcast. And then we also have a community for technical empathy. So people from all different roles and walks of life who are looking to increase this skill. And you can go to empathyintech.com to learn more there. So that's what I've got. So I will now stop sharing and go from there. Thanks everyone for all of the comments. I'm seeing that the audio may not have been great. So apologies for that. We do tech checks and sometimes they don't all work out. So Jim, I love your comment of who wrote this. Oh, wait, that was me. That's something I hear a lot. So excellent. So Sam and Tom, if you guys want to, I guess, come back to the stage and transition.
Actually, it's going to be me this time. Hi, Andrea. So, yes, Tom had to step out for a second, so we will. He'll be back for the next keynote. Yeah. So, if we do have any questions, we can hang out for a bit. We've got about 10 minutes before the next set of sessions start over in the Sessions tab. Thank you very much. This was wonderful, and I am definitely going to go back and watch this over again. So, we will, I believe we'll have this up on the YouTube channel afterwards. And we will prioritize getting definitely the keynotes up because a lot of valuable insight.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm planning on kind of hanging out here for a little bit after too. So, and I can start, I think in Hopin you can start a room. So I can definitely do that if people wanted to chat, a little bit later after that too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think we can definitely drop it to the normal background screen. And there will be, of course, the chat's active. I think you can, Andrea, you can participate in the chat as well if there are any. Mostly everything I'm seeing is, hey, this is helpful. So if there are any questions, absolutely everyone feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll be around. Oh, one question from Jesper. Is the link to the podcast on legacycode.rocks? Or where can we find the podcast? That's probably the better question.
Yeah, so you can link to the podcast on legacycode.rocks. Yep, and you can see all of the episodes. And then if you go to Empathy in Tech, right now the biggest thing is our Discord server. And then we have events. So I'm actually giving another event on Thursday. And it's communicating technical concepts clearly. So how do we actually communicate? So this is diving into one of those skills. So a lot of times we need to, as software developers, present really technical content to people who don't code or don't understand that domain. So these are specific strategies that you can use to kind of be more effective in the way that you present information, particularly technical content. And so we have a lot of free events over there. So you are welcome to join that. There's still time to sign up and participate if Thursday works well for you. And then the goal, fingers crossed, is to launch a podcast as well over at Empathy in Tech too. So
nice.
Yeah.
So is that over at Empathy in Tech? Just to double check where it's at.
Sorry, I'm struggling. Could you repeat that?
Oh, I was just asking to a double check on where that sign up is, because there's
So it's empathyintech.com.
okay, Empathy in
Yep.
Tech.
Yep.
And how do we find the Slack group Discord channel meetup? I know we had some of the links.
Here. Yeah, so there is a Slack group as well. So over on Legacy Code Rocks. So both of the communities are structured where there is a place for interaction between people. So a lot of times people will talk about podcasts, or they'll just have something that they're trying to work through. And it's this community of people who have been there and who understand. So Sam, there's not as many LabVIEW folks in there, but a lot of the same, I think, principles apply even to, LabVIEW, even though, there's kind of more text editor based things, because you're still looking at usability, you're still looking at technical debt. And I think those are the kind of topics that we talk about a lot. And someone has described, so we meet, there's a virtual meetup as well at Legacy Code Rocks. So it's every Wednesday at 1:00 Eastern. And so you can show up there and just like meet other people who are thinking about, who are struggling with some of these challenges. And so then especially if you are in a very maker culture, so we think of it as like makers and menders. So there are people who are like really wanting to get things out fast, or also people who like really want to be slow and deliberate. And so how can you kind of find a community who can help you? I see a question of like, how do you practice empathy when others in your organization do not? So how do you do more than lead by example? That's a great question. And I think the nice thing about empathy and compassion in general is that you don't need any permission. You are there, like you can start right now. You've already started because you've learned more about it, right? But you don't have to necessarily wait on someone else. And so the best place to start is compassion. It really, really is. And starting with self-compassion too, where recognizing the difficulty that there is in navigating in a context or a culture that is challenging, right? Because if you focus on compassion, that's going to really buffer you emotionally and physically so that you can have more energy and more capacity for some of the more difficult things like actively listening. And so when you're practicing that compassion, like the loving kindness meditation that we went through, thinking about the people who don't operate with empathy. And, there's a saying in therapy that hurt people, right? So if you see someone who is lashing out, chances are they're struggling and there's some pain in there. And so, definitely you don't have to tolerate that behavior, but being able to just recognize the pain that they are likely in, and then sending the desire to have them feel safe and happy and healthy and living with ease, and like the genuine desire of, I want you to, take that pain away, right? And you don't necessarily have to do it, but again, just focusing there, then, you can look at some of the other skill sets in there, right? So maybe reaching out, asking for lunch, right? But really a lot of this is an internal process. And the important thing too with empathy or communication of any type is that you can't control other people. There is nothing you can do to control other people. However, you can control what's in yourself. So recognizing that like if other people aren't treating you well, like that's on them. But how you respond and how you think, and how you feel, those are things that you can control. So a big part of this too is recognizing what you can and can't control and letting go of the things you can't control and focusing more on developing what you can control. And so stoicism there's kind of a modern stoicism that kind of really embodies this as well. So that's a good place as well. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just there are so many techniques, right? It becomes really deep really quickly, and there are so many different practices. And so my hope is just to kind of consolidate all this and figure out like what are the mechanics of all of this, and how can you figure out where to start? And so my suggestion always is compassion.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Andrea. I think we're about 2 minutes out from the hour, which is when our next sessions start. So very much appreciate all the insight, all the advice, and breaking things down in a technical form, because that is the brain we all share here. So,
awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure. And yeah, I'm sure everyone else has also got a lot of insight out of this. So,
yeah.
All right, everyone.
So,
yes. Anything else? Any closing words?
Not that I can think of. I think I'm going to hop over. I'll create a room. So if anybody wants to join over there and kind of deepen some conversation about some of the stuff and ask, I'm happy to kind of hang out there for a little bit during the day. I blocked off my calendar. So I think that would be a good place. And I haven't set up the room yet, but I know with Hopin, that's one of the great things that you can do. So I'll plan on kind of hanging out over there for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.